Hey guys, it's Kesara, and today I'm gonna be doing my July end of the month reading wrap up. So this month I changed up how I was doing my reading wrap ups. I did a mid-month wrap up, and now this is my end of the month wrap up where I'll talk about all of the things that I normally talk about in my end of the month wrap ups, but I won't be going in depth into the books that I read at the beginning of the month. I will still be ranking them as I normally do with the other books that I've read this month. It'll make more sense when we get into it, but if you guys missed my mid-month wrap up, I will link it up in the cards so you guys can definitely check that out. So as always, I'm gonna start with my reading stats for the month. So in the month of July, I ended up reading 29 things for the entire month, not the last 2 weeks, but the entire month, which is a lot even for me. But it's mostly because of the Avatar: The Last Airbender comics. I binge read all of them, and like they're really quick to read. Like you could read 3 of them in less than 2 hours. So we're gonna start by category. I read 7 fantasy books, 2 sci-fi books, 1 historical fiction, 1 romance, and like I said, I read a lot of graphic novels because I read a total of 18 graphic novels. Then by age range, I read 9 adult books, 1 new adult book, 18 young adult, and 1 middle grade. Then we're gonna go by source. So 5 of the books I owned, 18 I borrowed from the library, 1 was from Audible, 1 was from Kindle Unlimited, and 4 are other. So I think those were the ones that I just read online. I found a version of it online that I could read for free that I didn't have to borrow it from the library. Next, by star rating. So I had a really good month star rating wise. I had kind of a very good and a very bad month because I had my lowest rated book of the entire year, probably of all time, which I gave half a star. But overall, I had 9 5-star books, which is like really good for me, especially considering only 1 of them was a reread, and probably at least 3 like new favorites of all time. And my average star rating was a 4.2 stars. Then by page count, like I said, I read a lot of shorter things this month. So I actually had 15 books that were under 100 pages, which is why I had so many books total. Average page count ended up being 211 pages, which is really, really low for me. Usually I'm into the mid 400s when it comes to average page count. Then we're going to talk about author's gender. So this was my month that I was supposed to read mostly women because it was my women in fantasy month. The Avatar: The Last Airbender comics, most of them are written by the same man. So I ended up reading 14 by male authors, 14 by female authors, and 1 that was multiple authors of both genders. It didn't quite work out, but like think about it, like page count wise, the majority of the pages that I read were by women, but overall number of books, they were evenly split between men and women. And then by race, and this is where like it's completely different than any other month because I was super into Asian inspired fantasy this month. Like just like I read like all the Asian inspired fantasy. So I ended up reading 7 books by white authors, 5 by black authors, which actually really surprised me because I wasn't trying to specifically read books by black authors. I just happened to pick them up. And then 17 books by Asian authors because I was just super into the Asian inspired fantasy this month. And then by country, I read 22 books from the US, 4 from Canada, 1 from the UK, 1 from Japan, and 1 from China. Then by publication year, surprisingly, I read 4 books that are new releases for 2020, but the time period that I read the most books from was from 2010, 2014, which is like about 10 years ago, and that was 10 books from that time period. And then by publisher, I think the only real call out by publisher is Dark Horse Books, which I've never read books by them before, but all of the Avatar: The Last Airbender comics are from Dark Horse Books, so it ended up being 14 books that were published by them. Now I'm going to be talking about my rereads for the month of July. So I did 2 rereads in the month of July. The first one was The 5th Season by N.K. Jemisin. I ended up giving this one 4.5 stars. I really enjoyed it, and I talked about it a lot more in my mid-month wrap-up. And in the second half of the month, I reread The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. I absolutely love this book. I love this series so much. It's one of my favorite series of all time, and I loved my reread of this one. I felt very differently about the book than I did the first time around. Like the first time around, I was just 100%, oh my god, this is amazing. I can't believe I just picked up this book. And this time around, I didn't feel that way. Like I expected what was happening. It was a very nostalgic read for me. I felt the grimdark parts of it a lot more than I was expecting to. Like specifically the Battle of Goylan Nice. It's based off of the Rape of Nanking, which is an actual battle in history. It is so descriptive. There are definitely things there that made me cringe a little bit, but I love that this book gets that dark. I do think that this is one of those types of books that can lull you into a sense of familiarity because like the beginning of the book, like the first third of this book is set in a school setting and there is a bit of magic involved. So because of that, I feel like people think that they're reading a certain type of book and then they get to the second half or just in part 2 because there's 3 parts in this book and realize, oh my gosh, this is a grimdark fantasy book. Like this is not what I thought it was going to be. I really felt like the plot moved too fast. Like I felt like this could have been 3 books in one, or at least 2 books in one. I almost wanted to spend like more time with each section, but at the same time, I liked how fast the plot moved. It's very plot driven. I do love the characters in this book also. I felt very differently about the characters upon reread than I did the first time around, because if you guys know the character Naja, I hated him the first time around. Absolutely hated him. This time around though, like every time him and Rin got into like a tiff, like while they were in school together, I was just like, yes, Naja, I love Naja. So yeah, I don't know, that was weird. And then Alton, the first time around, I was just like doe eyes for Alton the entire time, because he's kind of like this sort of figure at their school. And this time around, I was just like, no, Alton, don't care for you. So yeah, I don't know, it was weird, but I really enjoyed this reread, and I ended up giving it 5 stars again. Now we have to talk about my DNFs for the month. So I had 2 books that I did not finish this month. I don't count them as like true DNFs, because I do plan to continue on with them eventually, but I did put them on pause in the month of July. The first one was Monstrous Volume 1 by Marjorie Liu. So this one, I was just on a graphic novel kick, and I didn't think that I would have the next like issue of Avatar: The Last Airbender to continue on with. So I wanted to try a different graphic novel, and I've heard a lot of really great things about Monsters specifically as a high fantasy graphic novel, and I have to say it is gorgeous. It's one of the most beautiful artwork that I've seen in a graphic novel. It's super detailed, and it's very dark. Like I didn't expect it to be as dark as it is, because all the other graphic novels that I've read have been more comical. It was definitely not what I was expecting going into it, and then I got access to the rest of the Avatar: The Last Airbender stuff, so I was like, you know what, let me just put this one on pause for now, and then I will continue on with it later. So I do plan on continuing on with Monstrous eventually, just not right away. Maybe in August, most likely closer to like October. And the next one was The Empire's Ghost by Isabel Steger. I was just not in the mood for this. Like I really wanted to read like high fantasy, but I was really in the mood for Asian inspired fantasy, and this is not Asian inspired. I do think this is the type of book that I will really like when I'm in the mood for, but because I wasn't in the mood for this, it just didn't seem like I was giving it a good chance for me to actually like it. This is a very politically driven high fantasy about a empire that was like broken apart, and someone is trying to reconquer it basically, and it has multiple different character point of views and a lot of things that go on in this. I didn't get super far into it, so I don't really know super in depth what was going on, but what I did read, I did enjoy, and I do plan on continuing on with this probably very soon, but I just didn't get around to it in July. So now we're going to talk about my fantasy book series challenge. So the 2 books that I picked out to read in the month of July were Legend by David Gemmell and A Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula Le Guin. So unfortunately, I didn't get around to reading Legend by David Gemmell, so this will be rolling over into next month. I did, however, read A Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula Le Guin. So this is considered middle grade fantasy about Ged, who will one day become one of the most powerful sorcerers in Earthsea, but now he's a young, reckless youth. It's so great. It's so magical in ways that I didn't expect. There's a lot of action. I listened to this one on audiobook also, and the audiobook narrator was fantastic. I absolutely loved the audiobook narrator. I'm really excited to see where this book is going. I didn't expect there to be as much magic in it as there was. I mean, I guess I should have expected it because it's called A Wizard of Earthsea. It's about a wizard, so obviously there's a lot of magic in it, but I didn't expect that, and I love the way the magic was done. I love Ursula Le Guin's writing style, and while I didn't love the plot as much as I wanted to, I still really enjoyed this book, and I ended up giving it 4 stars. Now we're going to continue on to ranking all of the books that I read in July from lowest rated to highest rated. So during the month of July, I ended up binge reading pretty much all of the Avatar: The Last Airbender comics. I talked about most of them in my mid-month wrap-up, so definitely check that out. I had very wide-ranging star ratings for each of the different comics. I talked about most of them in my mid-month wrap-up, but in the second half of the month, I finally got to the Lost Adventures. So the Lost Adventures is a series of like short stories told in comics that are from the TV show. So they're short stories that are like cutouts of the TV show, which is why it's called The Lost Adventures. I think most of them were like supposed to be like the comical asides for the TV show, but so most of them I just thought were kind of funny, but were interesting. But there were like 1 or 2 that I like really liked, and I wish they had included in the TV show. But overall, I just think this is one that like, unless you're like a really big fan of Avatar: The Last Airbender, which I am, you probably won't get that much out of it. So while I enjoyed it, I only ended up giving this one 3.5 stars. Also at 3.5 stars, we have A Beautifully Foolish Endeavor by Hank Green. So I talked about this in my mid-month wrap-up, so I'm not gonna go super in-depth in this one, but it is a new adult sci-fi novel, which is a sequel to An Absolutely Remarkable Thing. I loved An Absolutely Remarkable Thing, but I was a little bit disappointed with the sequel, which is why I ended up giving it 3.5 stars. Next, we have Take a Hint, Danny Brown by Talia Hibbert, which I ended up giving 4 stars. It's a romantic contemporary novel, which I also talked about in my mid-month wrap-up. At 4.5 stars, we have Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. You guys know I love Octavia E. Butler, and this is a historical time travel novel, which is really great, and I talked about this one in my mid-month wrap-up as well. And at 4.5 stars, we have Full Metal Alchemist of Volume 7, which I also talked about in my mid-month wrap-up. Next, I'd like to talk about The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett. So this is a historical fiction novel about twin sisters, Stella and Desiree, who are black, but they're light-skinned. They're estranged at the beginning of the book because Stella left her hometown and basically is passing herself off as white, while Desiree stayed in her hometown and she had a baby with a very dark man, so she has a daughter who is very dark. It's a multi-generational story, so it's about the two twin sisters who look exactly alike but live very different lives, and then it's also about their daughters who don't look anything alike but meet later on in life, and it's just so well done. I really enjoyed this book. It's such a great execution of a very interesting concept. I think the characters were really well developed, especially Stella. Stella is probably my favorite character in this book because she does a lot of things that, like, you completely understand why she's doing it, but at the same time, you know inherently that it's wrong, that she shouldn't be doing it that way, but you can't blame her for doing the things that she does. I mean, some of the things are just really bad that I kind of want to blame her for, but for the most part, like, I understand where she's coming from. I wouldn't go about doing things the way that she did it, but I understand what she is doing. I loved it so much. I loved, like, just that morally gray sort of aspect to this book was my favorite part of this book, but like, all of the characters are really well done. I like the way all of their storylines are kind of woven together, and while the ending wasn't my favorite, I did love this book overall, and I ended up giving it 4.5 stars. Then we have The Curse of Chelian by Lois McMaster Bujold. I did not expect to like this book as much as I did. As I started reading this book, I was like, oh, it's kind of slow moving. It's following this character named Kesara, which I didn't find him particularly interesting. Like, he is almost sort of like a typical high fantasy character in the sense that he's like this old, like, battle-hardened sort of warrior who has this like very bleak outlook on his life, and he like returns to be like a secretary tutor to the Royess Estelle. But this book really grew on me. Like, I found myself really engrossed in the story without realizing it. It's very political, but this book is just so subtle. Like, you don't realize things are happening until like they happen, and then you could think back and go, this was happening the entire time. There's a really subtle romance. I wouldn't really consider this like a romantic fantasy, but there is a romance in here that is very subtle. It's just mostly done through descriptions rather than interactions, which is an interesting way of doing it until like the very end, but I absolutely loved it. There's also a lot of political stuff that happens in here in a very subtle way that I really liked, and just like the last third of this book is so cool. I absolutely loved it. Like, I didn't expect half of what was happening in the last third of the book, and it's so hard on the characters, like physically and mentally and emotionally and just everything. I love this so much. I feel like this is the type of book that'll really grow on me with time. Like, the longer I sit and think about this book, the more I like it. So I feel like when I finally do reread this book, because I will eventually after I've read like all of the rest of Lois McMaster Bujold's work, because I haven't read anything else by her. This is my first book by her, and it was fantastic. I really enjoyed this, and I ended up giving it 4.75 stars. Next in the rankings, we have The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin. This is a supernatural sort of urban fantasy novel, which I talked about in my mid-month wrap-up. I absolutely loved it, and I ended up giving it 5 stars. Also, I have a full review for this one, so I will link that up in the cards if you guys want to check that out. And I have to talk about Jade City by Fonda Lee. I absolutely love this book so much. So technically, I'm not done with it yet. I have just a bit left to go. But there's pretty much no way this ending could make me not like this book. I absolutely love the setup of this book. The world building is amazing. I love the characters. There are 3 kind of like main characters, 2 brothers and a sister, and they're kind of the leaders of this clan. Well, the sister's not so much. She's kind of like a little bit of an outsider at the beginning of the book, but she's decided to come back home. I love the setup because each of the siblings are so different and they have such unique opinions of each other that work really well and make sense, but at the same time are like definitely biased in ways that I really really like. And while they're family and they work together and they work really well together, they each have like their own conflicts that are irreconcilable differences, which I absolutely love it when a book fits in irreconcilable differences like that. And there's tons of politics and action, and I love it so much. Also, about halfway through this book, it went in a completely different direction than I thought it was going to be, and I loved it so much. Like, it surprised me so much. And when a book can surprise me like that with its plot, there's very little that can happen after that that'll make me not like the book. So I'm loving this so far, and this is definitely going to be a 5-star read for me. I do plan on doing a full review for this book, so look out for that in the next coming days, but this is definitely going to be a 5-star book for me. And lastly, my favorite book that I read in the month of July was The Sword of Kaigen by Emma Wang. Just an absolutely fantastic adult high fantasy novel that elicits such intense emotions. I absolutely loved every second of this book. I talked about it in my mid-month wrap-up, and I also did a full review on this one, a very lengthy review on this one, so I'll link it up in the cards if you guys want to check that one out. Let me know in the comments if you've read any of these books, because I would love to discuss with you guys. I post videos on Sundays, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, so consider subscribing. And if you want to be notified as soon as I upload, you can click that little bell icon. If you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up to support my channel. All social media links are in the description down below. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.